Howdy ho people. Today we're going to be taking a look at The Fisherman by John Langan. This was first published in 2016 and it is a literary horror piece that it deals with a lot, I would say. It's got, the main themes of it are kind of grief and loss, but we've got a lot of supernatural elements, almost interdimensional ones as well, folklore, mythology, sorcery, which is very rare for me to read, even, to be honest, and I would put that down as a credit to the writing in it, but I was also invested in the story by the time this came up, so you kind of like, you know, there's no real choice there. It's like you're already in it, you're in the middle of it now, and you're quite hooked and intrigued. But I'll get onto that a bit later. Our story is told by Abraham, and from the off he's telling us about from the off we get a reference to Moby Dick, basically. It's a quote to introduce the story, and then he says, like, in a roundabout way, call me Abe, which is very, you know, like call me Ishmael. And so we've got kind of two references to Moby Dick. And I don't know whether that was the author kind of forewarning you about the length of the novel, because it's, although it's, you know, it's a bit longer than average nowadays, but it's still only about 260 odd pages, so it's not that long. But it's certainly longer than the ones I've been reviewing so far. But I don't know whether he was trying to kind of hint that, yeah, you better get ready for this. But also, because of the reference to Moby Dick, with that being an epic, it made me wonder whether there was a double meaning there going on, because it's later used via the narrator that the section he's about to go on to, the story within the story, is also very long. So a little bit of a warning there. My main beef with stuff like that, just from a perspective, or a certain perspective rather, is that at times it feels a little bit cheap. It feels like the author's telling you, okay, this part is really long. I could either try and trim it down to a more appropriate length, or I could just tell the reader and warn them, and then they won't complain about it afterwards. Which I think is always a bit risky. I think if you're gonna, if you're confident of the length of it, fuck the reader. Let them just read it, and they can make the decision whether they think that or not. If by warning you a little bit, I found it a bit like it can tempt you to already have a kind of confirmed bias opinion of it in a way, if you know what I mean. And I do think that's true. I mean, especially with today's kind of mindset. But regardless of that, I'll get main onto the plot. So Abraham has lost his wife, and he's kind of in a grieving stage. He's telling this in the past tense, so this is before, but at the same time, you know, you're in that part of the story then. And one day he gets an urge to go fishing during this kind of grieving process. I think it's a few months after his wife passed, but I'm not quite sure on how long it was. And also, I mean, the fact that she was terminally ill also would have helped his grieving process, because, you know, once you know someone's going, it's like the process of watching someone die is also, it plays a part in the grieving process. But anyway, he gets his urge one day. It's not a want, it's a need to go fishing. And he starts going fishing, and before he knows it, it's a religious experience basically. He goes all the time. He's like, you know, it's not just the weekends, it's after work, whenever he can, whenever it's in season, he's fucking fishing. That's basically what he does. We soon meet another character who he works with called Dan, and he's also grieving because he just lost his family, basically. I won't detail how, but yeah, he's lost his wife and kids, and he starts going fishing with him, and it starts becoming something of a similar nature, I suppose, for him. And despite not really having anything in common, despite their grief, or apart from their grief, they kind of strike up a friendship, and yeah, that's kind of how the story goes. And then we hear about this place called Dutchman's Creek, and Dan wants to go there, but he won't really give the reasons why. And whilst they're on the way there, they run into someone who does know the kind of history of it, and because it's pissing down with rain, slightly conveniently, he starts going into the story of it, and we get told that through our narrator telling being told it through this character. So although you could have a suspicion of the reliability of this particular narrator, Langan again qualifies that because he kind of neurologically plants it in your head that he's reliable, so just trust him and go with it. And because the character's quite likeable, I found him, I took a shine to him probably in about 15 pages really. Like, I quite liked him. I thought he's got a good heart and he feels honest. But also Langan puts in that whole kind of myth about fishermen being amazing storytellers and stuff like that. So although that might be true, I don't know how that could be confirmed, but at the same time it's also a nice neurological kind of implant that it's putting in there, so saying like, yeah, you can trust him. And so once they meet this character inside this kind of diner when they're having breakfast, he starts telling the story of Dutchman's Creek. And here we go into the story within the story. And we get that foreshadowing of, this is fucking long, by the way. So, yeah, you kind of know what to expect, but it's very long. It's not just long, it's long. It's really long, it's so long, man. And yeah, it's... And so within this part, here we kind of get into different kind of types of storytelling, I suppose, because we get the history of Dutchman's Creek, or at least how it came about, and this kind of, we go into more folklore and mythology, sorcery again eventually, and we cut from, like, I think we go into the 19th century, or the early 19th century even, and then we come into the 20th as it goes on, and how they connect to each other. And although I did really enjoy it, and I thought some of it was not entirely frightening, but unsettling at least, and quite unnerving, I did think it was too long. I have to admit, I will say that. I felt like I was rushing it a little bit at times, because I was just getting like, I want to get back to the main story with this guy now. Why does it keep going on about this? But it was also very fascinating, and although it did use stuff that isn't anything new, you got books of like dark magic and stuff like that, and I feel weird even saying that, because I wouldn't read a book normally that has this kind of content, but because it's kind of the story within the story, I kind of allowed it. And I also allowed it as well because people in those times didn't have the endless distractions that we have now through technology advancements and things of that nature, because people of the past, and this is proven, that without certain stimulations the mind will make stuff up, basically. So hallucinations were very much part of people's existences back then, especially for like lonely people, because and the reason it's proven is because of sensory deprivation they've seen with prisoners who they put in solitary confinement for a long period of time, or the whole, if you've watched enough films. They will experience moments of like feeling completely almost out of body, and they will hallucinate stuff, and basically because the mind you can't control it. So, and I mentioned this in Fubar, by the way, and I detail it with far more eloquence, so if you haven't read it already, buy it. So then we're in this story, and without trying to give too much away, the only real complaint I have about it is it made the ending too obvious, and it did make it predictable. But I will add that I was still very much invested and still very intrigued to see how it would end, and I actually did care about the two kind of mainish characters within it. Although Dan is a bit weird, but you can kind of understand that with the kind of trauma he's gone through. So, but because of what happens in the I'll say the middle section, because it's saying story within a story just gets irritating. But yeah, so the middle, the ending of the middle makes it too obvious what the ending is going to be like, at least, and you can kind of predict it quite easily. Even the middle of the middle, I'm going to fucking go mental. But yeah, even that kind of like, it's an obvious foreshadowing. Like, it's not just foreshadowing, it's blatantly obvious, but maybe it won't be for you, I don't know. And then when we come back to the actual story that Abraham is telling about himself rather than about the past of this Dutchman's Creek, because they're obviously on their way there, they kind of brush off the story as nonsense, you know, bollocks, all that kind of stuff. But then you as a reader is like, well, it's kind of obvious that that's what's about to happen. I still really liked it. I thought it was creepy, unnerving, a bit like... It really detailed a kind of otherness, I suppose, that I think quite a few of us feel. I can't really give any credit to its realism, but the way nature works without us kind of thing is so bizarre and unpredictable and possibly completely unknowable. And I suppose that is the feeling that evokes the most kind of fear. And I think the novel overall really does that well. And it's kind of it's an interesting one because it's not entirely literary and it's not entirely horror. So it's got a nice blend there, which I do think created a unique kind of piece, despite the fact that it had a lot of tropes that are nothing new. So I did think it had something about it that was quite poignant, and there's some beautiful moments in it, like regardless of the horror side. I thought Langan's descriptions of grief especially were actually really spot on, and something that I really took a shine to the character mainly because of that, because he's not a flawless character. He's a typical kind of everyman who getting on a bit, he's in early retirement, and he's just a bit like, he's very typical of an area he lives in, really. He uses the kind of colloquialisms and the kind of typical language, and for the most part that's fine. Sometimes it gets a little bit irritating, and I did find sometimes the grammar was a bit weird because of that, and I don't know whether that was intentional or not, but it was fine overall. It was a small gripe, really. My major gripes were probably with the risky element of trying to fit a story in the middle that is going to play a major part of the end, is the fact that you do basically give away quite a lot by doing that. So there is a risky element of it, but I admire it at the same time, because it's like, oh, despite the fact that it might be easy to see where it's going, if you can still retain the reader's attention and need to read it, then you've achieved something that is quite hard, I would say. And I was definitely intrigued, and the actual ending of the piece as a whole, I was an idiot and didn't realise what it actually meant at first. I was just kind of like, oh, okay, so that's the end, is it? Big whoop. But then I was fucking walking the dog, and then it clicked. So I was like, that's what that meant. Very nice, actually. Creepy, kind of like I got an eerie feeling from it almost. I was like, oh yeah, that's quite weird. But I think that was mainly because, okay, I won't say this actually because it will spoil it, because it's actually a really good ending. I thought it was quite haunting and a little unsettling and a little bit unnerving, and yeah, overall it's a tricky one to review in a sense, because I could talk about many elements of it, but because it's quite, I wouldn't say it's a beast, but it's long. It's longer than your average piece nowadays, and I did really enjoy the kind of different storytelling techniques that are within it, because it's got lots of different little stories that all connect, and they do so very well, I would say, overall. And I thought how he did detail and describe these kind of weird fantastical elements when we're in the kind of, it's not quantum, but the supernatural and kind of the dimensional kind of elements and the kind of underground worlds and stuff like that. And I don't normally read shit like that, but because it was told through a different perspective, I suppose, or as a story, then I could actually invest more into it, because it wasn't being taken seriously, if that makes sense. It's like, that's why I don't like fantasy, because the rules can be changed so easily just to suit the narrative. I think it's too easy. Unless you have a very strict world, it's there's always a kind of easy answer, if that makes sense. That is my main gripe with fantasy stuff. It's like you can always do anything. There's no set rules, because it's like, even if you do have these set rules, by the time you go on, you can just change them, or you can have someone who has the power to change them, and shit like that. Which is why I'm not too into it that much. But because it was told with that in mind, I would say, it actually made it quite interesting and added to the kind of eerie creepiness of it. And it's definitely got something about it. I'll probably give it a 4 out of 5 overall. The gripes I had would knock off that other star, because it's just like, okay, I can't quite get on board with the whole piece, but I did actually really think Langan had something quite special with it overall, and maybe my opinion of it will change with time, but yeah, I definitely recommend it. And yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. It's got a bit of a different flavour than most horror novels nowadays, and I think literary horror is quite hard to do. I mean, some people probably have described it as Lovecraftian in some regards, and although the themes are quite similar in certain moments, I found it to have its own voice, and that's a feat in itself, I would say. So yeah, that's it. That's my review of The Fisherman. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. If you've read it, leave me a comment below. What did you think of it? If you want to check it out, let me know later on. I'm always around. I'm not going anywhere, baby. So yeah, that's it. I'm going to go now. Bye.